You know, a good reminder from Genesis chapter 1, verse 3 is God always pierces the darkness, always. And the darkness doesn't last.
And the high priest, the great high priest who is Jesus Christ, he puts his hands on your life and you take your hands off and you say, my life is surrendered for your purposes.
Well, hey, welcome back to another episode of the Downline podcast. I'm Jamie Trussell, the privilege of pastoring out in the Austin area at Redeemer Dripping Springs and serving Downline Ministries, which is a real joy. Very excited today. I'm joined with the man of fortitude who saw me through my doctoral completion, Dr. Greg Ganssle. Greg, thanks for making time to come on.
Oh, thanks, Jamie. I should say Dr. Trussell. It's a privilege to be with you.
Dr. Trussell, yes, says, no, my wife doesn't even call me that.
No. Yeah. Well, my wife said when you got your master's degree, I didn't call you master. So
that's a good point. Yeah, great point. All right. Hey, Greg, for those that might not be familiar, can you give us a little intro of your background and where you're at now and the type of stuff you've been working on?
Okay. Well, I spent a lot of years in campus ministry with Cru, and that's how I discovered philosophy, by trying to answer students' questions. So I started to chip away at studying philosophy and eventually wound up with a PhD. And after that, my wife and I and kids, we spent 20 years at Yale in Connecticut, where we launched a Christian think tank called the Rivendell Institute. And a lot of it was on how do we help believers in the academy grow deep in their relationship with the Lord, and then to integrate gospel mission with their work. 10 years ago, I came out to the West Coast to Talbot School of Theology, which is part of Biola University, and I teach in the master's degree in philosophy out here. The stuff that interests me, academically, I work in a lot of what we call analytic philosophy of religion, arguments for and against the existence of God, the nature of God, this kind of thing. But I have a growing interest in more public-facing apologetics and philosophy, things about the meaning of life, things about what it means to flourish as a human being. Working on a book I've been wanting to write for a million years, comparing Jesus to Nietzsche in terms of their vision of life. And so that's the kind of thing that I love to think about.
Well, even thanks for sharing that. Even as you talk, I sit here thinking, how on earth did I ever graduate? Because I might be the only person from the state of Alabama with a doctorate from a Christian philosophy professor. We just don't rise that high.
Well, or you don't sink that low, right? You guys have careers in football, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Unfortunately, I'm not sure I was gifted in that direction.
Yeah.
Hey, so I'm curious, you were at Yale for 20 years. You've still been in this kind of world of philosophy and apologetics. Before I want to show everybody, I'm going to base a lot of questions off this book, which I really enjoyed, called Our Deepest Desires, which you wrote some years ago. But what's some of the shifts that you've seen, cultural landscapes? Because I feel like 20, 30 years ago, more data-driven, objective, evidence-based apologetics kind of ruled the day. Seemingly now, it's more emotional or feeling-based or sensory centric. Would you agree with that? Or in what ways have you seen things shift as far as how to reason for Christian faith in the public sphere?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's been a shift, and you describe it very well. There used to be much more of a worry about, is Christianity true? And much of our apologetics has been aimed in that direction. Now, we're always going to have to do that. This will never kind of get put on the back shelf. Every generation of people wants good reasons to believe in God, good reasons to believe in the resurrection, answers to objections. So we have to keep doing this. But the shift you point to illustrates that there's a different obstacle. The front door to conversations about Christ is often closed, not because of truth questions, but because of goodness questions. Is the Christian story good? Is it something that's attractive? In fact, I'm spending too much time reading Nietzsche, so I have to throw him in here. He's got a quip where he says, what is decisive against Christianity now is our taste, not our reason.
Mm.
And he was one of the early people trying to put forward this kind of critique.
Yeah.
And so I think there's more of that happening, and we have to pay attention to how do we hold forth the gospel as a compelling vision of life, one that's attractive. And that's what that book is about that you have. Yeah.
Well, sure. Yeah. And I was gonna say, a forward thinker on some of those things as he illustrates taste. We would echo that now, right? There's so much
Yep.
about modern sensibilities in America and even Western culture that Christianity is not tasteful. It's exactly what Paul talks about. People will crave for things that tickle their ears, things they want to
Yep.
hear, things that
Yep.
sound great. But what's interesting is at its core, probably what you write about, the deep desires of every single human, those don't actually change. The way the
Yeah.
tastefulness of what we're pursuing maybe changes, but there's still the desire to belong, the desire to love and be loved, and all of these things. Is when you say, I'm just going to read the subtitle, how the Christian story fulfills human aspirations. What are you trying to get to as you attack it from that angle?
Yeah, exactly what you said. I think, I mean, the text you quoted from Timothy, you know, people attracting teachers who tickle their ears, that image speaks to something that's kind of surfacey and doesn't really grip the human person. But when we go deeper and think, what kind of lives do people really want to live? We see that if we can get to that point, there's a great convergence with the Christian story.
Sure.
Um, I mean, I think the fruit of the Spirit in Galatians 5 should be our key apologetics text,
Okay.
because we can read that to someone and say, isn't this what you want? Don't you want your relationships characterized by love and joy and peace and patience and kindness and goodness and gentleness, faithfulness, self-control? And everybody, if we're honest, and if we allow the conversation to go a little deeper,
Yeah.
is going to say, yes, that's the kind of person I want to be. Yeah.
Well, and this doesn't mean to be, condescending or trite, but if someone were to respond to that and say, no, I desire for my relationships to be oppressive and evil and selfish, and we've got categories and names we put on some of those things because
Yes.
we don't see that as normative.
Yeah. Yeah. And in a conversation, I mean, you want to be very gracious in conversations, but I would be tempted to challenge the person and say, no, you don't. Right. And if I really thought that's what you wanted, then I could never let you babysit my children.
Oh,
It's like,
without a doubt.
now, of course,
Yeah.
mine are old, so it
Yeah.
doesn't matter to me anymore. But it's like, I can't. You're saying you want to be the kind of person I can't trust.
Yeah, that's a great way of putting it. So,
Yeah.
so one of the things you highlight, I'm going to read you your own writing, talking about we flourish in relationships, which even in secular, Western thought, community is such a big word. Not being isolated, belonging, all of these things. And you write this: although the meaning and value of relationships are not incompatible with atheism, they don't fit as well into the atheistic story. The lack of fit is found in the fact that things that are most important to us are least at home in the atheistic universe. What do you mean by that?
Well, it has to do with, well, on one hand, moral virtues. So the quality of our relationships are governed by many things. One is moral virtues, things like we see in the fruit of the Spirit
Right.
that are spiritual but also moral: goodness, faithfulness, loyalty, truth telling. And the whole concept of moral virtue is much less at home in an atheistic universe. Now, I don't want to claim, as the text said that you read, that you couldn't have a moral story in an atheistic worldview, but there is a kind of a singular lack of fit there. And it'd be really surprising if you just start with atheism and say, what should we expect the world to be like if atheism is true? You wouldn't expect it to be a place where deep moral virtues are important to us. They might be like hobbies or something like that, but it's a little surprising how important they are to our flourishing. So that's kind of an example.
Yeah, talk a little bit more. Maybe if you could pick one about that. Why, if someone say, well, I don't believe in God, but I still deeply love my kids, and that's important to me, and that seems to fit perfectly fine with how I view and live life. Drill down a little bit more for us on why is that such a lack of congruency?
Yeah, I think what the first thing we have to say in a conversation like that is of course you love your kids, and it's a good thing that you do. And I'm
Mhm.
not saying that you can't do that, but think about um, where does a parent's love for the children fit in an atheistic world? Now, there are places like it's important to the growth and flourishing of children, which is important to the survival of the species. But an atheistic universe doesn't actually care about the survival of the species. you
Hmm.
know, it has no, you know, th- this is in fact the point behind atheistic natural selection,
Mm.
that the environment doesn't choose or pick. The environment is what it is, and organisms bump against the environment.
Sure.
And so it's good for my children that I love them, but there's nothing really deeply meaningful in a cosmic sense. I make the distinction in the book between global meaning and local meaning.
Sure. Yeah.
And
Explain that because I think that's helpful.
yeah, it's been helpful to me to think about it. Global meaning is meaning that's outside of us, meaning that is not just meaning I choose. Local meaning is the meaning I choose. So
Mm.
I might choose to be an environmentalist. Let's say I'm an atheist and I believe the world is atheistic. I might choose to be an environmentalist, and these things have value to me. Well, we don't want to deny that they really do have value to people.
Sure.
Local meaning is actually meaning, but it's not connected to anything outside of us. The universe doesn't care. There's no purpose with a capital P. I use the illustration in there about playing a board game like Monopoly. I don't even know if people still play Monopoly.
Oh, we
Yeah,
do. Just so
yeah,
you
okay,
know, for 5-year-olds, which our youngest is now, there's Big Truck Monopoly, and it's awesome.
okay.
It takes 15 minutes. You play the whole game.
Oh my gosh, that's great. So you're playing big truck Monopoly or regular old Monopoly, and in the game, like in the Monopoly, the $500 bill matters.
Hmm.
And but as soon as the game's over, it doesn't matter at all. It's just a piece of paper. And so that's kind of like local meaning. The $500 bill has local meaning in the game, but it's not connected to anything that makes it meaningful outside the game. And that's kind of an analogy. I In an atheistic world, I might choose to pick up a cause, say environmentalism or racial justice, and these are really good things, but but their meaning is only found in the fact that I choose them and that they can help people. Um, Outside of life, once my life's over, it doesn't matter. Whereas the Christian
Exactly.
story, we're grounded in God. Hmm.
So, in that, we have that relational flourishing, and we have the idea too of personal freedom,
Hmm.
right? That we really do want our choices to matter.
Hmm.
And we also want, and we know this by the way we react when we kind of don't get what we desire,
Yep.
right? If I react in a certain way, it shows that deep down, I think this did actually transcend me because my reaction is disproportionate to just a localized meaning. Does that make sense?
Yes, that can be true. It might not always be true, but it can be true, right? We invest things with a meaning that's disproportionate, like you said, to local meaning, and and I think that could be a clue that we want something more.
And that's a better way of saying it. What I'm
Mhm.
driving at is almost so if I were to take my friend that's gung ho about the environment and acknowledge that's meaningful and it
Mhm.
does have local meaning. But if I were to ever suggest that maybe there's an incongruency on the identity they're deriving from being plugged into
Mhm.
that meaning. Well, if that sends them into orbit, there's a little bit of a clue there that, hold on, you're actually building more here about yourself than you thought you were.
Yeah, that's a good point. I'm not sure I was thinking about that when I was working on that book. Um, it you are you are revealing in that conversation that a person might be um, trying to draw global meaning
Mm.
from something that, in his own worldview, can only have local meaning.
So let's take that a step further. How do you then talk to that person about what's going on inside of them is a deep desire,
Hmm.
and we call that deep desire a longing for the ultimate good or God.
Yep.
Where do you
Yep.
bridge? Where do you bridge that?
Well, I think, I mean, what we want to do is, and we've been doing this in the conversation, affirm the local meaning,
Hmm.
but we can ask questions like, wouldn't it be better? Wouldn't you prefer it if these things were connected to a transcendent meaning?
Mm.
And so you can talk about a Christian view of environmentalism. That, wait a minute, in the Christian view, God gave us the task to cultivate the earth, and
Yes.
that requires not exploiting it. Um, and so a Christian view of environmentalism grounds this in something that lasts beyond just the atheistic story. I mean, this is a side topic a little bit, but one of the mysteries about atheistic environmentalists is, if you're really a good Darwinist, why be an environmentalist?
Yeah, that's a
Right?
great
It's
question.
just a matter of whatever the environment is, it presses against us and selects. And well, people say,
That's
well,
almost
human beings ruin the environment. Well, invasive species are just part of the Darwinian story. Anyway,
well.
that's a
I I was going to ask you about that, but I will segue into it now. I'll circle back on something else later. But so I'm reading again from you. I love the way you put this, and I think this fits with a true committed Darwinian. Uh, they should almost even celebrate
mm-hmm.
extinction and things not flourishing, right, at the expense
Right.
of something else. So here's what you say in atheistic stories. I love this. Each human being, and this is one of the great points of Christianity. In atheistic stories, each human being is ultimately defeated by suffering death. And yet, and I'll add to it, in the Christian story, uh, Jesus defeats suffering and
Yes.
death. Talk a
Yeah.
little bit more about how the atheistic narrative is ultimately defeated by suffering and death.
Yeah. Go back to the Monopoly game again. Um, you've got these meaningful things going on within the game. You've got hotels and houses and get out of jail free cards and money. And ultimately, though, the value of those things ends
Mm-hmm.
because somebody wins, you pack up the game, and you go back to real life.
Game's over.
Game's over. And that's what happens to every human being. So you might say, well, look, you can work for things that outlive you.
Mm.
That's true, but eventually the human race dies out.
Mm. And
And
that's it.
that's just part of the picture. And so it shows that, and I think it's a clue that any attempt to take local meaning and leverage it for filling the need that global meaning fills is
Mm-hmm.
is ought to be seen to be inadequate, and we have to
And
help people see it.
well, not only inadequate, but also incongruent. Even
Incongruent. Yeah.
even the fact, to get back to your idea of desire, even the does, well, let me phrase it as a question. Does the desire deep inside of a human for something more, is that not in and of itself a clue that local
Hmm.
meaning isn't enough and that an atheistic universe has no reason to account for the depth of that desire?
Yeah, I mean, the smart atheists, of which there are many, are going to have a story to tell about these kinds of desires. Um, but I think the persistence of these desires and the depth of them, um, the Christian or the theistic answer is a better explanation
Mm.
to whatever the atheist comes up with. Because the atheist, it has to be either Darwinian or psychological
Mm.
or maybe sociological, but it's not going to be deeply moral
Right.
or deeply connected to a human nature that has intrinsic value, like we have because we're made in the image of God.
What do you, or how do you engage with that whole idea? You mentioned deeply moral, because we would both affirm we've probably got secular or atheistic friends that have a very committed moral compass. They're
Mm-hmm.
kind,
Yep.
faithfully married,
Mm-hmm.
gentle, all these things. But there's a difference in performative moralism and moralism from an obligation. I am obligated to do X, Y, and Z. How do you account for moral obligation in an atheistic universe?
That's a great question, and it's really insightful that you specify obligation, because I think that's the hardest part of an atheistic morality.
Hmm.
I think an atheistic morality can ground a kind of, there's a goodness to certain kinds of actions, but obligation is hard. Why am I obligated to care about the survival of the country or my community or the human race or anything like this?
Sure. It may
And
have transactional value to you,
yes, exactly. Yeah.
but are you actually transgressing this transcendent obligation that would be true of all people at all times?
Yeah. And I think that's the hard part for an atheistic morality. And so there are moral theories where the obligation question is either kind of minimized
Mm-hmm.
or just kind of taken to be obvious, as if it's a question that doesn't need an answer.
Well, that's kind of the easiest way to not
Yeah.
have to deal with it, right?
It seems to me. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So let me ask you. I told you 30 minutes, so we got 8 minutes or so here. I do
Yeah, we
want
can
to,
go as long as you want.
and this is outside of our deepest desire a little bit. Maybe it tunes in, but I think one of the common questions still, probably even for a lot of our listeners, still trying to reconcile obvious evil
Mm-hmm.
and the existence of a good God. Now, I think maybe that the existence of what we would call evil actually proves the existence of God. I
Mhm.
think that's actually the clearer way to view it. But how do you explain that if you're faced with, okay, I choose, I do not believe in God because I look and I see X, Y, and Z. What's
Yeah.
your process of responding to that?
Well, in a conversation, I always start with the same question.
Okay.
When somebody says, "What about evil?" I always ask, "What kind of evil do you have in mind?"
That's good.
Because if a person answers like this, "Well, war and poverty and homelessness," I know that person is asking the theoretical question. But if a person says, my father just was diagnosed with cancer," then the person is probably asking a more existential question, like, how do I make sense of my life in the context of suffering?
Yeah, there's personal pain and
Yes.
and difficulty involved in that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then if someone's asking the theoretical question, I try as soon as possible to change. I mean, my phrase is not going to sound helpful. I want to change the subject from belief in God to Christianity.
Okay.
Because if the way philosophers have talked about the problem of evil is, well, suppose God is, really powerful, really knowledgeable, and perfectly good. Okay, how can we reconcile evil? And those are fair philosophical questions. But as soon as we start bringing in the Christian story, then the whole contours of the conversation changes.
Okay. Explain that.
Because the atheist is asking a question that can be put like this. I mean, sometimes I don't want to lump everyone in one category. Why, if God is this great, why isn't he doing more about evil? But the entire Christian story from Genesis 3, not the first 2 chapters, but from the 3rd chapter, is about what God is doing to respond to human evil.
That's right.
And the whole Christian story has to do with the origin of evil, the effects of evil, why we hate evil, what God calls, how God enlists us in pushing back the effects of evil, and of course the ultimate defeat of evil at the cross.
That's right.
You can't really have a good comprehensive picture of the problem of evil without talking about the cross and the resurrection.
The cross, I'd be curious your thoughts on this. You mentioned both a theoretical question about evil and then a deeply personal one. It's honestly at the cross is we get the answer to both.
Exactly. Yes.
That whether we understand why something is happening, we at least know God's not indifferent to it because he subjected his son to evil and suffering as well. So he at least can sympathize and entered into it with us.
Yeah.
So that's deeply personal, but also it touches and solves the theoretical and philosophical.
Yes. Yes. And then we see in the Christian story, specific resources for each of these. One of the specific resources is the presence of God with us through his Spirit. And another one is the ultimate defeat of evil.
Yes.
That we're waiting for. And he will wipe away every tear.
That's right.
And these things are crucial resources to understand evil. So if the conversation is limited to just the theoretical picture of God, we are cutting ourselves off from actually the resources we have to answer it.
No, that's great. And going consistently and immediately to the actual Christian story helps particularize.
Yes.
Yeah. That response. So we talked a little bit about freedom and relationships and even the idea of evil. What else in our last few minutes would you say is a deep desire of humanity that the Christian story answers in ways that an atheistic story simply cannot?
Well, there's probably a lot. We talked about meaning, global meaning, purpose, the value of human beings. What's really interesting in the secular West, people are deeply committed to the equality of value of human beings.
Yeah, good point.
And that doesn't fit on atheism. I mean, I'm glad people have this view, but it's incongruent. And our creation story affirms this, that all people are made in the image of God. And then the fact that God became human in Christ ratifies the value of human nature. Another one in the book I talk about is beauty.
Yes.
Beauty is kind of it's kind of like a stone in the shoe, where if we think about it, it points to an artist. It makes more sense that reality was created by an artist than just by a mechanical process that is perfectly immune to things like beauty and goodness.
And I love how you put, one of your points in the book is you don't actually set out to find something beautiful. You're struck by, you're like almost disrupted and interrupted by beautiful things.
Yeah. I think that's right. Yeah.
Okay. Last thing, I'll get you out of here with this. If people want to go, more deeply into this, I found you to be a great, both personal friend and resource, but if people are on the front end of kind of going, I want to help younger Christians firm up their faith amongst some of these questions, while also I want to engage evangelistically, which one thing I learned from you, which I love in class, was responding with questions and really pushing people to think to the furthest logical conclusion.
Yes.
Just help them keep going, because most people stop their thinking at the place they're comfortable.
Yeah.
Which does not force them to deal with all these incongruencies that we're talking about. But what would be next steps for people that want a little more equipping in this?
Well, and I think your observation is true for believers and unbelievers. Thinking is uncomfortable. Well, in our conversations, we want to ask questions, right? We think we should be giving answers, but
Yep,
people don't want
absolutely.
answers, right? People want a question that's worth asking. So let's
That's
help
good.
people ask questions that are worth asking. Um, and then I would think this opens up a posture of how I read the scriptures.
Hmm.
And I try to read with a sense of, okay, how does this connect to my humanity?
Hmm.
I think a lot of believers have, you use this word in a different context, a transactional understanding of our relation to God. And it's
Sure.
all about forensic justification. And of course, those things are very important.
Right.
Um, but but God is in the business of wooing us, wooing
Hmm.
human beings. He wants to restore the image of God. He and so reading the text, like, okay, so for example, to be a little more concrete, when I read the gospel stories, I think, what are these people like? When am I
Hmm.
like this person? Who am I in this story?
Yep.
Why do I hesitate to approach Jesus this way? And kind of ask those deeper questions, even about the engagement I find in the scriptures.
Sure.
Um,
No, that's super helpful. And I would say too, something that's been, I think, helpful for me that in this process or meeting with other people as
mhm,
well is if I were to grant the cultural narrative, Greg, that
mhm.
you, Greg Ganssle, the atheistic non-Christian, you are the center and locale of truth,
Yeah.
and your feelings determine it. Let me grant you, for argument's sake, that
Mhm,
that is true.
mhm.
That works in my favor because you are telling the ultimate truth that you have really deep desires that are not being met
Yeah.
by how you're living life. Does that make sense?
Yes. Yeah. I think what you've got here in the way you phrase this is the I'll put it in grandiose terms. The soul of the atheistic human being is kind of the fertile ground
Mm,
for the conversation.
that's
and
good.
and we want to help cultivate that and draw out of people. When it comes to deep desires, one of the great advantages to this kind of approach is it puts us all in the same boat.
Hmm,
We're all trying to make sense of our lives. We're trying to
that's good.
navigate our lives with a sense of, what kind of person do I want to be? And the more we can be in the same boat with somebody, the less we are kind of a hostile force.
Yes,
And we think, yeah, everybody's just trying to make sense of life and navigate the best we can. And when we have these conversations, the more we emphasize that,
that's
the
right.
better. Hmm.
Well, I think, and it's something you taught us in class so much of everywhere the gospel goes, it seeks to affirm something and correct something.
Yes.
And
Hmm.
the desires that a lot of people have, it could be manifested in a really sinful way, but
Hmm.
there's at least an affirmation of, oh, you desire acceptance and you're getting
Yes.
it in a really destructive way.
Yeah.
Let's tap into that desire and show you the way in which Jesus does it far more perfectly.
Yes. That's excellent. That's really true. I think I've been reading through the Temptations of Jesus, partly because I have to preach on them on Sunday, and these temptations were all things that the Father wanted for Jesus,
Mm,
right? He didn't turn stones into bread, but he turned 5 loaves into enough for 5,000,
yeah, good
right?
point.
And he is Lord over all the kingdoms in the world.
That's right.
And God displayed his great majesty in rescuing Jesus from the grave and exalting him above all rule and authority. And so I think sometimes as Christians, we don't want to give any ground in a conversation, and
Mm,
we're always in corrective mode. But if
yes.
we think about the fact that every person's made in the image of God,
Mm,
I want to look for the true and the good and the beautiful in what a person is doing or holding or saying, and then get behind that and carry it forward, rather than feeling like I have to correct every statement. I don't
yeah.
expect non-Christians to have good theology. So I'm not going to correct their theology. I just
I
want
don't
to.
expect a lot of Christians to have good
Well,
theology.
That's true too.
Yeah.
And so the more we can kind of latch on to the things that are fertile ground for further fruitful conversation, the better able we can connect with people.
Well, look, in your, academic life and being an author, and I know you've got a lot on your plate. I really appreciate you carving out the time to join us, and I'm
Oh, it's a
excited just
pleasure.
personally to expose so many people to you, and you've been a great friend to me. So thanks for jumping on.
Good, and we're looking forward to your book being published. So I'll put a plug for that for your audience.
You and 3 others.
Yes, well, yeah, but they really care, those 3.
All right, thanks, Greg.
Great, thanks, Jamie.
I want to thank everyone for listening to this episode of the Downline podcast. Please subscribe and go down and rate us and give us 5 stars. Help us get this content out to as many people as possible, as we hope to continue to equip men and women to join the Great Commission as we make disciples for a lifestyle as a lifetime.